is Karina.
Matt.
My name's Anna and this is a sign for A.
My name is Jack, as in J for Jack.
Callum.
Natalie.
G for George.
Lena.
Ophia.
We just popped in to say hello. We just popped in to hear the show, the show, the show. You'll hear the show and then you'll go. There's more to know, so take it slow. The show, the show, the show.
Blah, 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 blah. Hello, everyone. Blur here. Now, you've been doing some excellent 10-10s throughout all these weeks. So this week, I thought I'd leave it up to you as to what to do. First, we got a bit of spinning. Then we got a bit of juggling. But you decide what you want to do. Keep your imaginations working, everyone. Blah, 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 blah.
Let's start. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Stop.
Let's go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and stop.
Let's start. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Stop.
Blum, blue, blee, blaw, blen, blix. Oh, Blur really struggles with numbers. If only there was someone called Sarah who could teach me all about the numbers. I hope there is. Sarah, is that you?
Hello. What can we sign today? Numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yay! Numbers.
Hello.
Hello.
A lot of people have been asking us how you spell
Blur.
well, when we say a lot of people,
A couple of people.
a couple of people have been asking us how you spell blur, and there's lots of different ways. One way is like this.
The second way is like this.
And
The third way is like this.
but you know what?
But you know what? You can spell it how you want. And you know what I want to see? As many different ways that you can spell Blur as possible. So get out there
and show me your blurs. Stay safe. Love you. Miss you.
Good morning, everyone. Time to wash my hands. Shaker, 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 thong. Shaker, 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 thong. Scrub your hands. I am green. Wash them now. Wash them clean. So it's been another great week, everyone. You've done some spinning, you've learnt numbers with me, but now we're going to delve into Tails' past and have a look at an old character. He's an old friend of ours and his name is Emergency Repairman. If you want it fixed, he can fix it. Let's have a look, everyone. Let's go into the past. Past.
Hello there. What seems to be the problem?
Our car. It's broken. You don't know anything about fixing things.
No, I don't. Stay there. But I know a man who does.
ERM!
That's right. ERM. Emergency Repairman. If it's broken, I can fix it.
Emergency repairman, here he comes. Emergency repairman, #1. Emergency repairman, here he comes. Emergency repairman.
Tails made a home beam straight to your screen. It's our new idea called Tails TV. Tails through the night and Tails through the day. Tails online and here to stay. Tails don't pause, they only play. Tails for your heart and Tails for your dreams. Let's all get together and
Blah 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 blah.
together and
Blah 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 blah.
together and
Blah 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 blah.
watch Tails TV.